Get out! Get out of this place right now! The venomous command came from the mother-in-law, Genevieve Vance, her voice cutting across the manicured lawns of the Hamptons estate. Her target was the bride, Seraphina Jones, now standing utterly alone at her own wedding reception. 200 of New York's most powerful guests leaned in, hungry for the drama, expecting to see a woman broken by the public humiliation. But they saw nothing of the sort. Before we witness what happens next, it's incredible to see this community grow. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop a comment to let me know where and when you're tuning in from. The glittering assembly believed they were watching the disgrace of a social climber. They were wrong. They were actually watching the prelude to a reckoning. Because the secret arriving on that jet wasn't just meant to save the bride's dignity. It was designed to dismantle an empire. And every single part of it was her plan. The Hamptons estate gleamed under the late afternoon sun, its manicured lawns stretching like green velvet toward the ocean's edge. White roses climbed the trellises, their petals catching the light like tiny mirrors, and crystal chandeliers sparkled through the open windows of the Vance family mansion. It was the kind of perfection that demanded admiration, the kind that whispered wealth and power with every meticulous detail. Seraphina, Sera Jones stood at the heart of it, her wedding gown a cascade of ivory silk that clung to her like a second skin, its delicate embroidery shimmering with every step. She was a vision, a black woman radiant in a world that wasn't built for her, but bent to her will. Yet as she moved through the crowd of New York's elite, she felt their eyes, sharp, calculating, dissecting her every gesture. This was no ordinary wedding. It was a battlefield disguised in opulence. Sera's fingers brushed the stem of her champagne flute, her dark eyes scanning the sea of tailored suits and designer gowns. 200 guests, the city's most powerful financiers, politicians, and socialites, mingled with practiced ease, their laughter a brittle veneer over whispered speculations. They weren't here just to celebrate her union with Julian Vance, heir to the faltering Vance capital empire. They were here to judge, to weigh her worth, to decide if a woman like her, brilliant, unapologetic, and black, could truly belong in their rarefied air. At her side, Julian stood tall, his jaw set in that patrician way that spoke of old money and older secrets. His hand rested lightly on her waist, a gesture meant to reassure, but Sera felt the tension in his touch. He was hiding something. She knew it, had known it for months. Not the full scope. Julian was too proud to admit how deep the rot in his family's legacy ran, but enough to set her mind spinning. Enough to make her wonder if the man she just vowed to love was her partner or her pawn. The string quartet shifted to a softer melody, signaling the start of the reception's formalities. Sera's gaze flicked to the head table, where Genevieve Vance, Julian's mother, sat like a queen presiding over her court. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, her emerald green dress a statement of understated dominance. But it was her eyes that held Sera captive, cold, gray, and sharp as a blade. Genevieve didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a warning. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC's voice boomed, pulling attention to the stage. "Please join me in welcoming the mother of the groom, Mrs. Genevieve Vance, for a few words." A polite ripple of applause followed as Genevieve rose, her movements deliberate, predatory. She took the microphone, her lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth as polished marble. "Today we gather to celebrate a union, not just of two people, but of legacies, of traditions that have stood the test of time." Sera's grip tightened on her glass. She knew what was coming. She'd seen it in Genevieve's eyes the moment they'd met 6 months ago, when Julian had introduced her as his fiancée. Disdain, suspicion, a flicker of fear. Genevieve didn't just disapprove of Sera. She saw her as a threat, and she wasn't entirely wrong. Genevieve's gaze locked onto Sera, pinning her in place. "My son has chosen a remarkable woman," she continued, her tone laced with something venomous. "Seraphina Jones, a name we've all come to know in certain circles. A CEO, I'm told, a woman who thrives on disruption. Tell me, Seraphina, what is it you call it? Breaking markets?" Such a charming phrase for tearing down what others have spent generations building. A murmur ran through the crowd, a mix of amusement and unease. Sera's smile didn't falter, but her pulse quickened. This wasn't a toast. It was an ambush. She felt Julian shift beside her, his hand dropping from her waist. She didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to. "Mother," Julian said, his voice low, strained. "Perhaps we should—" "Oh, Julian, let me finish," Genevieve cut in, her smile sharpening. "I only want to understand. Your bride is a woman of ambition, isn't she? A— what do they call you, dear? The shadow of Wall Street? So poetic. And yet one wonders what shadows hide in such a title." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a feeding frenzy of gossip. Sera's father, a retired mechanic in a borrowed suit, sat rigid at a nearby table, his hands clenched. Sera caught his eye, offering a subtle nod to keep him grounded. She wouldn't let Genevieve unravel her family. Not here. Not now. Her phone vibrated in the hidden pocket of her gown, a faint buzz against her thigh. She didn't need to check it to know who it was. Dominic, her right hand, her strategist. The message would be simple, coded. Phase 1 of Project Nightingale complete. Awaiting your command for Phase 2. Sera's lips curved, a private smile that didn't reach her eyes. Genevieve thought she was exposing a pretender, a gold digger in a wedding dress. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Sera wasn't here to claim a piece of the Vance legacy. She was here to reshape it, to save it, and if necessary, to burn it to the ground. "Mrs. Vance," Sera said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. The crowd hushed, eager for her response. "I appreciate your curiosity about my work, but I assure you, my intentions here are as pure as this moment. I'm here for Julian, for love." The lie tasted bitter, but it landed perfectly. The guests softened, some nodding approvingly, others casting skeptical glances at Genevieve. Julian exhaled, a shaky breath of relief, but Sera felt no such ease. Love was part of it, yes. She'd meant every word of her vows, but love wasn't enough to blind her to the truth. Julian had come to her 6 months ago, desperate, confessing that Vance Capital was bleeding money, teetering on collapse. He'd begged for her help, offering secrets and access in exchange for her expertise. But he hadn't told her everything, and he certainly didn't know the full extent of her power. Genevieve's eyes narrowed, unconvinced, but she returned to her seat, the microphone relinquished. The crowd's attention shifted. The moment diffused. For now. Sera leaned toward Julian, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "You didn't warn me she'd come for blood?" "I didn't know," he murmured, his eyes pleading. "I thought she'd behave." Sera's gaze hardened. "You thought wrong." She turned away, her mind racing. The trap had been set, not by her, but by Genevieve. The mother-in-law wanted a spectacle, a public dismantling of the outsider bride. Fine, Sera would give her a show, but it wouldn't be the one she expected. As the quartet struck up again, Sera slipped her hand into her pocket, her fingers brushing the phone. One command, one word, and Phase 2 would begin. The jet was already on its way. The secret it carried would silence this gilded cage and everyone in it. Sera raised her glass to her lips, hiding the ghost of a smile. Let them think they'd won this round. They'd learn soon enough. Seraphina Jones didn't break. She built, and when the time came, she destroyed. The air in the Hamptons estate thickened as the string quartet's notes faded, replaced by the clink of crystal and the hum of murmured conversations. The sun dipped lower, casting golden streaks across the reception's white-draped tables, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the chill that had settled over Seraphina Jones. Her ivory gown shimmered as she stood beside Julian Vance, her new husband, but her posture was rigid, her dark eyes scanning the crowd like a general surveying a battlefield. Genevieve's opening salvo had drawn blood, not visibly, not yet, but Sera felt the wound all the same. The guests, New York's elite, sipped their champagne, their smiles sharp with anticipation. They smelled weakness, and they were ravenous for it. The ceremony itself had been flawless, a carefully choreographed dance of vows and promises under a canopy of roses. Sera's voice had been steady as she'd pledged her love to Julian, her words carrying a weight that went beyond the altar. She wasn't just promising herself to him, she was swearing to save him from the crumbling empire he was too proud to admit was failing. Julian's vows had been earnest, his green eyes glistening with what Sera wanted to believe was love, but doubt gnawed at her. Did he trust her enough to let her lead, or was he still clinging to the illusion of control? The MC's voice cut through her thoughts, bright and oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around the head table. And now, let's invite the mother of the groom, Mrs. Genevieve Vance, to offer a toast to the newlyweds. Sarah's stomach tightened. Another toast? After Genevieve's earlier attack, cloaked as a welcome, this felt like stepping into a lion's den with a blindfold. Julian's hand brushed hers under the table, a fleeting gesture of reassurance, but it felt hollow. She didn't look at him. Instead, she fixed her gaze on Genevieve, who rose with the grace of a predator, her emerald dress catching the light like armor. The crowd hushed, their attention rapt, sensing the promise of more drama. Genevieve raised her glass, the champagne catching the fading sunlight. "To my son, Julian," she began, her voice smooth but laced with venom, "and his ambitious bride, Seraphina." The pause was deliberate, a knife slipped between ribs. "Today we celebrate not just love, but the joining of worlds. Our family has always valued tradition, legacy, the purity of what we've built over generations." Her eyes flicked to Sera's father, Marcus Jones, seated at a nearby table, his calloused hands folded tightly in his lap. "But we live in modern times, don't we? Where outsiders, those who chase ambition over heritage, seek to claim what isn't theirs." The crowd froze, glasses halfway to lips, eyes darting between Genevieve and Sera. Marcus's jaw clenched, his weathered face a mask of restraint as Genevieve's words landed like a slap. Purity, heritage. The implications hung heavy, a dog whistle to the old money elite who nodded subtly, their prejudices confirmed. Sera's heart pounded, not with fear but with fury. This wasn't just an insult to her, it was a calculated strike at her father, a retired mechanic who'd worked his hands raw to give her a chance at a world that now sneered at him. "Mother," Julian said, his voice tight, rising from his seat. "That's enough. This is a wedding, not a boardroom." Genevieve's smile didn't waver. "Oh, Julian, don't be so sensitive. I'm merely speaking to the importance of legacy, of bloodlines that endure." She turned her gaze back to Sera, her eyes glittering with malice. "After all, some might mistake love for opportunism, a chance to climb where one doesn't belong." The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that fueled the growing tension. Sera's fingers curled into fists beneath the table, her nails biting into her palms. She could feel the weight of every stare, the judgment of a room that saw her as an interloper, a vulture in their gilded cage. But she wasn't here to beg for their acceptance. She was here to win. "Mrs. Vance," Sera said, her voice calm but carrying an edge that silenced the murmurs. She rose, her gown flowing like liquid starlight, and faced Genevieve head-on. "Your concern for legacy is touching, but let me assure you, I'm not here to take what isn't mine. I'm here to build something new, with Julian." Her words were measured, a shield and a sword, but the lie beneath them burned. She wasn't just building a marriage, she was orchestrating a takeover, one that Julian only half understood. Genevieve's lips twitched, a flicker of surprise quickly masked. She raised her glass higher. "To building, then," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. "May your ambitions serve you well, Seraphina." The toast was met with hesitant applause, the guests unsure whether to celebrate or brace for more. Sera sat, her pulse racing, her mind already calculating. Genevieve wasn't just testing her. She was laying the groundwork for something bigger, something uglier. And Julian? Julian had stood up, yes, but his words had been weak, a half-hearted attempt to smooth over his mother's venom. "She didn't mean it like that," he whispered to Sera as the crowd resumed their chatter. "She's just protective of the family." Sera turned to him, her eyes cold. "Protective?" she repeated, her voice low enough to keep their conversation private. "She just called my father an outsider in front of 200 people. Julian. And you let her." I didn't let her, he protested, his face flushed. I tried to stop her. You heard me. I heard you try to make peace instead of fight for me, she said, her words sharp enough to cut. You knew she'd come for me today, didn't you? And you didn't warn me. Julian's mouth opened, then closed, his silence a confession. Sera's chest tightened, not with sadness, but with the sting of betrayal. She'd known Julian was desperate when he'd come to her 6 months ago, begging her to help save Vance Capital from collapse. She'd agreed, not out of charity, but because she saw an opportunity, a chance to wield her genius as the shadow of Wall Street to reshape an empire. But she'd also believed in him, in their love. Now that belief wavered. Her phone vibrated again, a discreet buzz in her gown's pocket. Another message from Dominic, no doubt, confirming the next move in Project Nightingale. Sera didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. The plan was in motion, and Genevieve's toast had only solidified her resolve. This wasn't just about saving Julian's legacy anymore. It was about proving she could outmaneuver the woman who thought she could break her. As the quartet resumed, the guests returned to their conversations, oblivious to the storm brewing. Sera leaned back in her chair, her expression serene but her mind a furnace of strategy. Genevieve had raised a poisoned chalice, expecting Sera to drink. Instead, Sera would pour it back down her throat. She glanced at Julian, who was staring at his plate, his shoulders slumped. "Fix this," she said softly, her voice a command wrapped in silk. "Or I will." Julian nodded, but his eyes were distant, caught between loyalty to his mother and the woman he'd married. Sera didn't wait for his response. She turned her gaze to the horizon, where the faint hum of a jet engine was just beginning to pierce the evening's calm. Phase 2 was coming, and with it, the reckoning. The Hamptons estate pulsed with a restless energy, the golden light of dusk now giving way to the soft glow of lanterns strung across the reception. The clink of glasses and forced laughter filled the air, but beneath the surface, the crowd was ravenous, their eyes darting toward Seraphina Jones, waiting for the next act in the drama Genevieve Vance had ignited. Sera stood at the edge of the dance floor, her ivory gown a beacon in the sea of black ties and glittering jewels. Her composure was a fortress, but inside her mind churned, calculating every move, every word, every glance. Genevieve's toast had been a declaration of war, and Julian's weak defense had left Sera exposed. She was done playing the gracious bride. Julian stood beside her, his hand hovering near hers as if unsure whether to touch her. His face was pale, his jaw tight, caught between shame and desperation. Sera didn't look at him. Her focus was on Genevieve, who had retreated to a corner of the tent, surrounded by a cluster of old money allies, her smile sharp as a blade. The mother-in-law wasn't done. Sera could feel it, like the pressure drop before a storm. The MC's voice crackled through the speakers, pulling the crowd's attention back to the center of the tent. "Ladies and gentlemen, please gather as we continue the evening's festivities." The guests shuffled toward their seats, their whispers buzzing like static. But before the next toast could begin, Genevieve stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. She didn't take the microphone this time. She didn't need to. Her presence commanded silence. "Seraphina," Genevieve said, her voice carrying across the tent with chilling clarity. "A moment, if you please." Sera turned, her chin lifting, her dark eyes locking onto Genevieve's. The crowd held its breath, sensing the escalation. Julian stepped forward, his voice low. "Mother, please, not now." But Genevieve ignored him, her gaze never leaving Sera. She reached into a sleek leather portfolio at her side and pulled out a stack of documents, bound in black. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed them onto the nearest table, the papers landing with a thud that echoed like a gavel. "You think I wouldn't do my homework?" Genevieve said, her tone icy, triumphant. "You think I'd let a predator like you slink into my family without a fight?" The word predator hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. The guests leaned forward, their murmurs rising into a fevered hum. Sera's heart pounded, but her face remained a mask of calm. She knew what was coming. Genevieve had been digging, and she'd found something, or thought she had. "These," Genevieve continued, tapping the documents with a manicured nail, "are records of your so-called business ventures, Seraphina. 3 companies, competitors of Vance Capital, swallowed whole by your firm in the past year alone. You call it restructuring. I call it destruction. You're no bride. You're a vulture picking at the bones of my family's legacy. The crowd erupted into gasps and whispers, phones slipping out of pockets as investors and socialites began texting furiously. Sera's father, Marcus, sat frozen at his table, his eyes burning with a mix of pride and pain. Julian's face drained of color, his gaze darting between his mother and his wife. "Sera," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Is this true?" Sera didn't answer him. She stepped forward, her gown trailing behind her like a royal mantle, and faced Genevieve head-on. "You've done your research, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the chaos. "But you've missed the bigger picture. Those companies weren't your competitors. They were liabilities, bleeding money, dragging your precious legacy into the dirt. I didn't destroy them. I saved what was worth saving." The crowd's whispers grew louder, a mix of shock and intrigue. Genevieve's smile faltered, but only for a moment. She straightened, her eyes narrowing. "Saved them? For whom? Yourself? Don't play the altruist, Seraphina. You're here for one reason, to finish your hostile takeover. You've been circling Vance Capital like a shark, and this marriage," she gestured to Julian, who flinched as if struck, "is just your way in." The accusation landed like a grenade, and the tent exploded into chaos. Guests turned to one another, their voices rising, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Sera's reputation as the shadow of Wall Street was no secret, but Genevieve had weaponized it, painting her not as a savvy investor, but as a corporate spy, a traitor in a wedding dress. The narrative was shifting, and Sera felt the ground beneath her tremble. Julian grabbed her, his voice urgent. "Sera, tell me she's wrong. Tell me you're not—" "Not what?" Sera snapped, pulling her arm free. Her eyes blazed, not with fear, but with fury. "Not the woman who's been propping up your family's failing empire? Not the one who's been cleaning up the mess you were too scared to admit existed?" Her words were a whip, and Julian recoiled, his silence damning. He hadn't known the full scope of her actions, but he'd known enough, and he'd said nothing. Genevieve seized the moment, stepping closer, her voice rising to a crescendo. "Get out!" she shouted, her finger pointing at Sera like a judge delivering a verdict. "Get your corporate poison out of my house. You don't belong here, and you never will." The words echoed, a public indictment that silenced the tent. Every eye was on Sera, waiting for her to crumble, to flee in humiliation. Her father's hands trembled on the table, his face a mask of anguish. The guests leaned forward, their anticipation palpable, ready to witness the fall of the outsider bride. But Sera didn't move. She didn't flinch. Instead, she straightened, her shoulders squaring, her chin lifting. The wounded bride was gone, replaced by the woman who'd built an empire from nothing, who'd earned her fearsome nickname through ruthless precision. She met Genevieve's gaze, her eyes cold, unyielding, a predator in her own right. "You're wrong, Mrs. Vance," Sera said, her voice low but resonant, carrying a weight that stilled the crowd. "I'm not here to destroy your house. I'm here to rebuild it, and you're about to see how." She slipped her hand into the hidden pocket of her gown, her fingers brushing the phone that held the key to her plan. Dominic's message was waiting, a single word: ready. Phase 2 was poised to begin, and with it, the secret that would turn Genevieve's accusation into ashes. Sera's lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile. The jet was coming. And when it landed, this gilded trap would become Genevieve's cage. The silence in the Hamptons estate was suffocating. Genevieve Vance's command, "Get out!" still ringing in the air like a gunshot. The guests, a constellation of New York's elite, stood frozen, their eyes pinned on Seraphina Jones, expecting her to buckle under the weight of the public indictment. Her ivory gown glowed under the lantern light, but it was her stillness that commanded attention. A statue carved from defiance, not despair. Julian stood beside her, his face ashen, his hands twitching as if searching for something to hold on to. He opened his mouth to speak, but Sera's gaze, sharp as obsidian, silenced him. This wasn't his moment. It was hers. Genevieve stood triumphant, her silver hair catching the light like a crown, her finger still pointed at Sera like a prosecutor sealing a conviction. The crowd's whispers had died, replaced by a collective anticipation, a hunger for the outsider bride's downfall. Sera's father, Marcus, sat rigid at his table, his weathered hands clenched, his eyes pleading for her to fight. And fight she would, not with tears or pleas, but with the precision of a predator who'd been underestimated one too many times. Sera's expression shifted, the mask of the wounded bride dissolving like mist. Her lips curved into a faint, dangerous smile, and her eyes locked onto Genevieve's with a cold intensity that made the older woman falter, if only for a heartbeat. The shadow of Wall Street was no longer hiding in the shadows. She stepped forward, her gown trailing like a war banner, and the crowd parted instinctively, sensing the shift in power. "You think you've exposed me, Mrs. Vance," Sera said, her voice low but resonant, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think you've caught a vulture circling your precious empire. But you're wrong. I'm not here to pick at bones. I'm here to decide what lives and what dies." A murmur rippled through the guests, a mix of shock and intrigue. Genevieve's smile tightened, her confidence wavering as Sera's words landed with surgical precision. Julian reached for her arm, his voice a desperate whisper. "Sera, what are you doing? Don't escalate this." She shook him off, her gaze never leaving Genevieve. "Stay out of this, Julian," she said, her tone icy. "You've done enough by doing nothing." The sting of her words made him flinch, his silence a deeper betrayal than any of Genevieve's accusations. Sera slipped her hand into the hidden pocket of her gown, her fingers closing around the phone that held the key to her plan. She didn't need to look at the screen to know Dominic's message was waiting, a confirmation that Phase 2 of Project Nightingale was ready to unfold. She raised her chin, her voice steady and commanding. "Dominic," she said, her words directed to the phone, but loud enough for the crowd to hear, "execute Phase 2. Now, and send the package here." The guests exchanged confused glances, their whispers rising again. Genevieve's eyes narrowed, her composure cracking as she sensed the ground shifting beneath her. "What game are you playing, Seraphina?" she snapped, stepping closer. "You think you can intimidate me with theatrics? This is my house, my family." Her words were cut off by a low, guttural roar that split the evening's calm. Heads turned, glasses clattering, as the sound grew louder, closer, a primal force descending on the estate. From the horizon, a sleek, matte black bombardier, Global 8000 jet emerged, its silhouette slicing through the twilight sky. It descended with audacious precision, its landing gear kissing the sprawling lawn of the Vance estate, tearing up manicured grass in a display of raw power. The jet wasn't a vehicle, it was a statement, a weapon cloaked in elegance, its lack of logos or markings only amplifying its menace. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, others craning their necks to see. Julian's mouth fell open, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Sera," he stammered, "what the hell is that?" Sera didn't answer. She watched the jet come to a stop, its engines winding down to a low hum, the door hissing open. The guests were transfixed, their earlier hunger for gossip replaced by awe and unease. Genevieve's face drained of color, her portfolio slipping from her fingers to the table. For the first time she looked small, her authority unraveling in the face of something she couldn't control. A man stepped out of the jet, his tailored black suit as sharp as the aircraft itself. Dominic, Sera's right hand, carried a carbon fiber briefcase, his stride purposeful as he crossed the lawn toward the tent. His face was unreadable, a professional mask honed over years of executing Sera's orders. He reached her side and handed her the briefcase, his voice low. "Everything you requested, Ms. Jones." Sera took the case, her fingers brushing the cool surface, her heart steady despite the chaos around her. She turned to face the crowd, her presence commanding every eye, every breath. "Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice carrying a quiet menace, "you accused me of being a predator. You're half right. I don't just hunt failing companies. I rebuild them. And your family's empire? It's been failing for years." The crowd erupted into murmurs, phones flashing as guests began recording. Genevieve took a step back, her hands trembling. "You're bluffing," she spat. but her voice lacked conviction. You have no power here. Sera's smile widened, cold and unyielding. Oh, I have more than you can imagine. She set the briefcase on the table, her fingers hovering over the latch. This isn't a game, Genevieve. This is a reckoning, and it's been a long time coming. She didn't open the case. Not yet. The weight of the moment was enough. The promise of what lay inside more powerful than any immediate reveal. The jet loomed behind her, a silent sentinel, its presence a reminder that Sera wasn't just a bride or a CEO. She was a force, one that had outmaneuvered Genevieve's every move. The crowd was hers now, their allegiance shifting as they sensed the tide turning. Julian stepped forward, his voice hoarse. Sera, please. What are you doing? What's in that case? She turned to him, her eyes cold with disappointment. You'll see, Julian, she said softly. You wanted me to save your family's legacy. I'm doing exactly that, just not the way you expected. The air crackled with anticipation, every guest on edge, waiting for the next move. Genevieve's bravado was crumbling, her empire teetering on the edge of exposure. Sera stood at the center of it all, the architect of a plan that was no longer a secret but a spectacle. The jet, the briefcase, the power in her hands, it was all hers, and she was just getting started. The Hamptons estate was a theater of stunned silence, the matte black jet looming on the torn lawn like a dark omen. Its engines had stilled, but the air thrummed with tension, every eye fixed on Seraphina Jones. Her ivory gown glowed under the lantern light, a stark contrast to the carbon fiber briefcase in her hands, its sleek surface reflecting the flickering flames. The crowd of New York's elite, once eager for her humiliation, now watched with a mix of awe and dread. Genevieve Vance stood rigid, her silver hair disheveled by the jet's downdraft, her earlier triumph reduced to a fragile mask. Julian, her husband of mere hours, stared at her, his face a canvas of confusion and betrayal. Sera felt the weight of their gazes but stood unyielding, the shadow of Wall Street in full command. Dominic, her trusted strategist, stood a step behind, his expression impassive as he handed her a wireless microphone from the MC's table. Sera took it, her movements deliberate, her dark eyes sweeping the crowd. The guests leaned forward, phones poised, sensing the unraveling of a spectacle they'd never forget. She tapped the microphone, the soft thud echoing through the tent, silencing the last whispers. This was her stage now, and she would not be interrupted. Mrs. Vance, Sera began, her voice clear and resonant, carrying a calm that belied the storm she was about to unleash. You called me a predator, a vulture. You accused me of orchestrating a hostile takeover of your family's legacy. She paused, letting the words settle, her gaze locked on Genevieve's paling face. You're half right. I have been circling Vance Capital, but not to destroy it, to save it. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the tent. Genevieve's lips parted, but no words came. Julian stepped forward, his voice hoarse. Sera, what are you talking about? Save it? From what? Sera didn't look at him. She couldn't afford to. Not when the truth was a blade, and she was about to wield it. She set the briefcase on the table, her fingers deftly unlocking it with a soft click. The crowd craned their necks, desperate for a glimpse of its contents. She lifted the lid, revealing a stack of documents, each stamped with the seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. The sight alone sent a murmur through the investors in the room, their instincts sharpened by years of navigating financial battlegrounds. Vance Capital, Sera said, her voice steady but laced with steel, has been insolvent for months. Your family's empire, Mrs. Vance, is a house of cards, propped up by lies and borrowed time. Julian came to me 6 months ago, begging for help. She turned to him now, her eyes cold, unflinching. Didn't you, Julian? His face crumpled, a mix of shame and desperation. Sera, I didn't want it to come to this. I thought you were just consulting, helping us restructure. Restructure? Sera's laugh was sharp, cutting through his excuses. You gave me 51% of your voting shares as collateral, Julian. You handed me the keys to your empire because you knew it was the only way to save it. She pulled a document from the briefcase, holding it up for the crowd to see. This is the agreement, signed by you. It gave me control, not to steal your legacy, but to rebuild it from the ashes you and your mother ignored. The tent erupted into chaos, guests whispering furiously, some pulling out phones to call their brokers. Genevieve staggered back, clutching the edge of a table, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You're lying," she hissed, but her voice trembled, betraying her. "You can't. Julian would never—" "He did," Sera cut in, her tone unyielding. "And you, Mrs. Vance, were too busy guarding your pride to notice your empire crumbling. You thought I was the threat, but I was the only one keeping it alive." She turned back to the crowd, her voice rising, commanding. "Project Nightingale wasn't a takeover, it was a rescue. I acquired your competitors not to weaken Vance Capital, but to eliminate the liabilities dragging it down. I redirected their assets, stabilized your cash flow, and kept your name out of the headlines, but I'm done working in the shadows." She reached into the briefcase again, pulling out a single sheet, its SEC watermark unmistakable. "This," she said, holding it aloft, "is the final piece. As of 10 minutes ago, as the majority shareholder and largest creditor of Vance Capital, I dissolved the old board of directors. Effective immediately, I've taken control." She turned to Genevieve, her smile cold and precise. "Congratulations, Mrs. Vance. You've just been fired by the daughter-in-law you tried to exile." The crowd exploded, gasps and shouts mingling with the frantic tapping of phones. Genevieve sank into a chair, her hands shaking, her empire stripped away in a single, devastating blow. The investors, once loyal to her, were already recalculating their alliances, their whispers turning to plans. Sera stood tall, the microphone still in hand, her gaze sweeping the room like a queen surveying her court. Julian grabbed her arm, his voice breaking. "Sera, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me?" She pulled free, her eyes blazing with a mix of hurt and resolve. "Trust you?" she said softly, her words meant only for him. "You let your mother tear me apart in front of everyone. You knew she was digging into my past and you said nothing. I saved your legacy, Julian, but you couldn't even save me from her." His face crumpled, tears brimming in his eyes, but Sera turned away. She handed the microphone to Dominic, who stood ready, his loyalty unwavering. "Secure the documents," she said, her voice low, "and prepare for the fallout." Dominic nodded, tucking the briefcase under his arm. The jet waited on the lawn, its door still open, a silent invitation. Sera's gaze lingered on Julian for a moment, a flicker of pain crossing her face before it hardened again. She'd given him her heart, her vows, her genius, and he'd given her silence. The crowd watched, breathless, as Sera turned toward the jet, her gown trailing behind her like a comet's tail. She didn't look back at Genevieve, now a broken figure in a sea of whispers. She didn't look back at Julian, who stood frozen, his world unraveling. The Nightingale's song had been sung, and its melody was one of triumph and sacrifice. The Hamptons estate was a battlefield strewn with the wreckage of pride and power. The matte black jet loomed on the torn lawn, its silent menace a stark reminder of Seraphina Jones's triumph. The tent, once a glittering stage for New York's elite, now buzzed with frenetic energy. Guests whispering, phones flashing, investors scrambling to salvage their stakes in the wake of Sera's bombshell. Genevieve Vance sat crumpled in a chair, her silver hair falling loose, her emerald dress a mockery of the regal authority she'd wielded moments ago. Her empire, Vance Capital, had been wrested from her by the daughter-in-law she'd scorned, and the crowd's allegiance had shifted, their eyes now fixed on Sera, the architect of this seismic upheaval. Sera stood at the center of the tent, her ivory gown glowing under the lantern light. The carbon fiber briefcase now closed at her side. The microphone was gone, handed back to Dominic, but her presence still commanded the room. Her dark eyes, sharp and unyielding, swept over the guests, who watched her with a mix of fear and fascination. She was no longer the outsider bride or the shadow of Wall Street. She was a force, undeniable, unstoppable, and they knew it. Genevieve's hands trembled as she gripped the table's edge, her voice a broken whisper. You can't do this," she said, but the words lacked conviction, swallowed by the reality of her defeat. The investors around her were already moving, their phones pressed to ears, their voices urgent as they recalculated their futures without her at the helm. Sera didn't spare her a glance. Genevieve's collapse was complete, but it wasn't the one that cut deepest. Julian Vance stood a few steps away, his face a mask of anguish, his green eyes glistening with unshed tears. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his old money pedigree, now seemed ill-fitting, as if he were shrinking beneath the weight of his own failures. He reached for Sera, his hand hovering, afraid to touch her. "Sera," he said, his voice cracking, "how could you do this? Why didn't you tell me?" Sera turned to him, her expression a storm of emotions. Fury, disappointment, and a flicker of heartbreak she couldn't fully suppress. "Tell you," she said, her voice low, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I told you enough, Julian. 6 months ago, when you came to me, begging for help, I told you I'd save your family's legacy. And I did. But you—" She stepped closer, her eyes boring into his. "You let your mother tear me apart in front of everyone. You knew she was digging into my past, planning this ambush, and you said nothing." Julian's mouth opened, then closed, his hands clenching at his sides. "I didn't know it would go this far," he stammered. I thought I could handle her. I was afraid, Sera. Afraid she'd find out how bad things were, how I'd failed." "Failed?" Sera's voice was a whip, sharp and unrelenting. "You didn't fail because Vance Capital was crumbling. You failed because you didn't trust me. You let me walk into this trap, let her call my father an outsider, let her paint me as a predator, and you stood there silent." She gestured to the crowd, their eyes still on her, their whispers a dull roar. "I saved your empire, Julian. I took control because you wouldn't. And now you have the audacity to ask why I didn't tell you?" Her words landed like blows and Julian flinched, his shoulders slumping. The crowd watched, their phones still recording, capturing every moment of this raw, unraveling confrontation. Sera's father, Marcus, sat at his table, his weathered face a mix of pride and pain, his hands no longer clenched but resting heavily, as if bearing the weight of his daughter's battle. He met her eyes across the tent, a silent nod of support, but Sera couldn't linger on it. Not now. She turned back to Julian, her voice softening, not with forgiveness, but with a cold, weary finality. "You wanted your legacy saved, Julian. I gave you that. I gave you everything you asked for, but you couldn't give me the one thing I needed: your trust." Julian's tears spilled over, his voice barely a whisper. "Sera, I love you. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was scared. Scared of losing you, of losing everything." "Scared of what?" she snapped, her composure cracking for the first time. "Scared your mother would find out you handed me your shares? Scared she'd see you for the man who couldn't save his own empire? Or scared that your wife is stronger than you'll ever be?" Her words were a blade slicing through the fragile bond they'd built. Julian staggered back, as if physically struck, his silence a confession. Sera's chest tightened, the weight of her own pain threatening to break through. She'd loved him, believed in him, vowed to stand by him. But love wasn't enough when trust was shattered. She turned to Dominic, who stood ready, the briefcase secure in his grip. "Doman," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her heart, "handle the fallout. Make sure the SEC filings are public by morning." Dominic nodded, his expression unreadable, but his loyalty unwavering. "Understood, Miss Jones." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the reality of Sera's takeover sinking in. Investors were already shifting allegiances, their calls to brokers now laced with urgency, some even approaching Dominic with cautious deference. Genevieve remained in her chair, a broken queen dethroned, her eyes distant, her power stripped away. But Sera's focus was on Julian, the man who'd promised her forever and delivered only silence. She took a step toward the jet, its door still open, a dark portal to her next move. The crowd parted, their whispers following her like a tide. Julian's voice broke through, desperate, raw. "Sera, please, don't do this. Don't leave me like this." She paused, her back to him, her gown trailing like a fading dream. For a moment she wanted to turn, to see the man she'd loved, to believe he could still be her partner. But the sting of his betrayal was too fresh, too deep. "You made your choice, Julian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of finality. "Now live with it." She walked on, her steps measured, her heart heavy but resolute. The jet waited, its engines humming faintly, ready to carry her away from this gilded cage and the man who'd failed her. The nightingale's song had ended, but its echo would linger, a testament to her power and her pain. The Hamptons estate was a tableau of ruin, its opulent facade shattered by the truth Seraphina Jones had unleashed. The matte black Bombardier Global 8000 stood sentinel on the torn lawn, its sleek form a stark contrast to the chaos it had heralded. The tent, once alive with the clink of champagne glasses and the murmur of New York's elite, now buzzed with frenetic energy, guests whispering, investors scrambling, their phones lighting up as they grappled with the seismic shift in power. Genevieve Vance remained slumped in her chair, her silver hair falling in disarray, her emerald dress a crumpled relic of her former dominance. The crowd's eyes, however, were not on her, but on Sera, the woman who had dismantled an empire in a single devastating stroke. Sera stood at the edge of the tent, her ivory gown glowing under the lanterns, a vision of strength and solitude. The carbon fiber briefcase was gone, entrusted to Dominic, who moved through the crowd with the efficiency of a man accustomed to cleaning up her battles. Her dark eyes scanned the scene, taking in the wreckage she'd wrought, not with pride, but with a weary resolve. She had saved Vance's capital, but at a cost she hadn't fully anticipated. The weight of Julian's betrayal, his silence in the face of his mother's venom, pressed against her chest like a stone. Julian stood a few feet away, his face etched with desperation, his green eyes pleading for a reprieve she wasn't sure she could give. The guests watched, their whispers hushed, sensing the final act of this drama unfolding. Sera's father, Marcus, sat at his table, his weathered hands folded, his gaze steady with unspoken pride. He'd raised her to fight, to rise, and she had, beyond his wildest dreams, beyond anyone's. But this victory felt hollow, tainted by the fracture in her heart. Sera turned to Dominic, her voice low but firm. "Doman, clean up this mess," she said, her words carrying the weight of a commander issuing a final order. "Ensure the transition is seamless. No leaks, no mistakes." Dominic nodded, his loyalty a quiet anchor in the storm. "It's done, Ms. Jones," he replied, already moving to coordinate with the investors circling like vultures, eager to align with the new power in the room. Sera's gaze shifted to the jet, its open door a dark invitation to leave this gilded cage behind. She took a step toward it, her gown trailing like a fading echo of the bride she'd been hours ago. The crowd parted, their eyes following her, a mix of awe and fear in their stares. She was no longer the outsider, the shadow of Wall Street. She was the architect of their future, and they knew it. Julian's voice broke through, raw and desperate. "Sera, wait!" He stumbled forward, his hand outstretched, as if he could pull her back from the edge. "Please, don't do this. Don't walk away. We can fix this. Together." She stopped at the foot of the jet's stairs, her back to him, her heart pounding against the cage of her resolve. For a moment she wanted to turn, to see the man she'd loved, the man she'd vowed to stand beside. But the memory of his silence, his failure to defend her against Genevieve's venom, burned too brightly. She'd given him her heart, her genius, her power, and he'd given her nothing but excuses. "Fix this?" she said, her voice soft but laced with steel, carrying across the silent lawn. "I already did, Julian. I saved your family's legacy when you couldn't. I took control when you wouldn't. I gave you everything you asked for, and you gave me nothing but silence." He took a step closer, his voice breaking. "I love you, Sera. I made a mistake. I was scared. Scared of losing you, of losing everything. Please give me a chance to make this right." Her fingers tightened on the railing of the jet's stairs, the cold metal grounding her against the ache in her chest. "A chance?" she said, her tone bitter, cutting. "You had your chance when your mother called my father an outsider, when she accused me of being a predator in front of everyone. You stood there, Julian, and let her tear me apart. You chose your fear over me." The crowd was silent, their phones lowered, their attention riveted on the unraveling of a marriage that had barely begun. Genevieve, still seated, looked away, her defeat absolute, her role in this drama reduced to a footnote. Marcus's eyes glistened, a silent testament to his daughter's strength, but also her pain. Sera took another step up the stairs, her gown catching the evening breeze. Julian's voice rose, a desperate cry. "Sera, what about us? What about our marriage?" She paused, one foot on the threshold of the jet, her silhouette framed against the darkening sky. She didn't turn, but her voice carried, clear and final, cutting through the stillness. "You got what you wanted, Julian. Your legacy is safe. Vance Capital will survive, but you'll have to decide if it was worth trading our marriage for." The words hung in the air, a verdict delivered without malice, only truth. Julian staggered back, his face crumpling, tears streaming down his cheeks. The crowd watched, breathless, as Sera ascended the final steps, her movements deliberate, regal. The jet's door began to close, the hiss of hydraulics a punctuation mark on the end of this chapter. As the engines roared to life, the guests stepped back, shielding their eyes against the gusts of wind. The jet rolled forward, its wheels carving new scars into the lawn, then lifted off, climbing into the twilight with a grace that belied its power. Sera was gone, a solitary figure ascending into the unknown, leaving behind a husband, a mother-in-law, and a wedding that had become a war. Julian stood alone on the lawn, his silhouette small against the vast estate, his future as uncertain as the empire he'd clung to. The guests dispersed, their whispers already weaving the legend of Seraphina Jones, the woman who'd reshaped a dynasty in a single night. The nightingale had sung, and its song was one of triumph, sacrifice, and a solitary ascent into a sky that held no promises, only possibilities. As the jet's roar fades into the twilight, Seraphina Jones's story leaves us standing on the edge of a transformed world, where power, betrayal, and redemption collide. What did you feel as Sera took control, dismantling an empire to save it? Did Julian's silence break your heart, or did Genevieve's downfall spark your applause? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and share what this tale stirred in you. Thank you for joining me on this electrifying journey through ambition and sacrifice. Until we meet again for the next story, keep chasing your own truths and rewriting the rules. Farewell for now.